Okay, so once again I've got an equation to solve. I'm rounding my answers so I know it doesn't factorise. And the best exam technique for this question would be to use the quadratic formula. But the whole point of this worksheet is to practice completing the square. So, I'm going to take my first two terms. I don't like the 5 in front of the x squared, so I'm going to go off to divide by 5 land. And that's going to give me x squared plus 2x. It's very straightforward to put this into completed square form. It's x plus 1 squared minus 1. This would be those first two terms in completed square form if I wasn't in divide by 5 land, so I'm now going to move back to the real world by timesing by 5. That's 5 times x plus 1 squared minus 5. And I mustn't forget about my plus 2. So this thing is 5 times x plus 1 squared minus 5 plus 2, which of course is minus 3. And I'm solving this thing equals 0. 5 times x plus 1 squared minus 3 equals 0. Just like I did before, I'm now going to solve this equation as if it was just a regular old equation. Adding 3 to the side and then dividing by 5 is going to get me x plus 1 squared equals 3 divided by 5 is 0.6. I'm going to take a square root now. X plus 1 is the square root of 0.6. That is 0.775. And that can be both plus or minus. Moving the 1 to the side makes it negative. Minus 1 plus or minus 0.775. And then I use the plus to get one solution and the minus to get another solution. Minus 1 minus 0.775 is minus 1.78 because I'm rounding to two decimal places. If I'm doing minus 1 plus 0.775, then I'm going to get minus 0.23. Again, rounded to two decimal places. So, this is done just like the other one was done as well. Although it looks more complicated, it's actually simpler because we avoid the fractions and the decimals as we go through the thing. On to the next question, and I'll clear some room. I'm asked to express x squared minus 7x plus 2 in the form x minus p squared plus q, where p and q are rational numbers. So this is a little bit of a holiday now. I don't have to do any of this divide by 2 or divide by 5 land and then scale it back up when I'm done. All I have to do is follow the rule of completing the square. So I'm going to make the first two terms of this thing look a bit different by putting the x in a bracket. I put half the 7 in the bracket, so I'm minusing 3.5. And then out here I always subtract whatever this is squared. And 3.5 squared is 12.25. That's now written x squared minus 7x in what is distinctly a more awkward way, but there it is. I mustn't forget about my plus 2, so I'm going to stick that on the end. And we'll do our tidying up. X minus 3.5 squared minus 2.25 plus 2 makes minus 10.25. And so my P and my Q are 3.5 and minus 10.25. In the next question, I'm asked to solve x squared minus 25x minus 2,200 equals 0. And I'm asked to show my working given my answers correct to two decimal places so I know it doesn't factorise. The best exam technique will be to use the quadratic formula, but for practice I'm going to use completing the square. The first two terms are going to be written as x minus 12.5 squared. And then I have to subtract on the outside of this 12.5 squared. And that's giving me minus 156.25. Let's not forget about the 2,200, of course, and the fact this thing equals 0. So I'm going to put together my 156.25 and my 2,200, and I'm going to shift that to the other side. So I've got to do 156.25 add 2,200 when it goes to the side, and that's getting me 2,356.25. So x minus 12.5 squared equals 2,356.25. If I take a square root, I get x minus 12.5 is equal to the square root of that number, which is 48.54. Remember, our square root can be plus or minus, and so now from here we've got x equals 12.5 plus or minus 48.54. If I use the add over here, we're going to get 61.04, which is the 12.5 add 48.54. And if you use the subtraction, we're going to end up with minus 36.04. And there's our answers correct to 2 decimal places. Let's have a look at the final problem. Rowena walks 2 kilometers at an average speed of x. We want to write down an expression for the time taken. So let's think about speed equals distance over time. Speed equals distance over time. When I substitute into that formula, I'm going to get x equals 2 over whatever time it is. I want to make time the subject, so right now it's underneath a fraction. I'm going to multiply by t on both sides, cancelling out that division, getting t times x equals 2. And so if I divide both sides by x, I'm going to get t equals 2 over x. Another way of doing this would be to use the formula triangle, if you're familiar with that. And in this case that would be faster, but I always like to use the same method to solve my equations and rearrange my formulas, so there it is. Rowena then walks 3 kilometers at an average speed of x minus 1 kilometer per hour, and the total time taken to walk the 5 kilometers is 2 hours. Now we get this quadratic equation that seems to appear out of nowhere, and as always with problem solving questions, we don't want to focus on where we're trying to get to, but where we're starting. We know the time taken for the first 2 kilometers is represented by 2 over x. She's then walking 3 kilometers at an average speed of x minus 1. So if I follow the same pattern I had before, I'm going to have the distance 3 over the speed x minus 1. And we know that entire process takes 2 hours. So that's the equation that represents the time that she's taking. Now, if I write that equation down, I notice there's fractions in it, and I'd like to get rid of those fractions. We get rid of fractions by multiplying every term by every denominator. So I've got x times x minus 1 on every one of these arrows. The divide by x and times by x will cancel out, and the divide by x minus 1 and the times by x minus 1 will cancel out. I now have 2 times x minus 1 in the first term, plus 3x in the next term, equals 2x times x minus 1 on the other side of the bracket. If I multiply out my brackets, I have 2x minus 2 plus 3x equals 2x squared minus 2x. This I recognize as a quadratic equation, so I want to organize it with x squared, x number, and then an equals 0. I'm going to keep my 2x squared where it is. I can see 2x plus 3x is 5x. If I move that 5x to the other side, it will be a minus 5x. That will go with the minus 2x to make a minus 7x. And if I move the minus 2 to the other side, it becomes a plus 2, leaving nothing, leaving 0 to compare it to. And that's the answer they wanted me to get to. Do not focus on whatever comes after show that. This is not important until you've actually done some work. Look at the information you've been given and do something useful with it. Find the value of x, show all your working and give your answer correct at 2 decimal places. In other words, solve the equation. Again, the quadratic formula in an exam will be the best approach, but I'm going to practice one more time completing the square. That means I'm going to take my 2x squared minus 7x and move over to divide by 2 land, because if I go to divide by 2 land, I get rid of that pesky 2 in front of the x squared. I can complete the square here by saying this thing is equal to x minus a half of 3.5, which is 1.75 squared, but I have to subtract the 1.75 squared in order to complete completing the square procedure. That's going to give me 3.0625. This would be the first two terms written in completed square form if I wasn't in divide by 2 land, so I've now got to go back to the real world and times by 2. That puts a 2 in front of my first bracket, and I get to multiply my 3.0625 by 2 to get its value as 6.125. That deals with the first two terms, but again I mustn't forget about my plus 2, and I mustn't forget I'm solving an equation which is equal to 0. Now, this thing tidies up to 2 times x minus 1.75 squared minus 4.125 equals 0. I'm going to move the 4.125 to the other side, and once that's done I'm going to divide both sides by 2, leaving with x minus 1.75 squared equals 4.125 divided by 2. That comes out as 2.0625. I'm going to square root both sides to get rid of that squared, and that's giving me plus or minus 1.44 to 2 decimal places. Moving the 1.75 to the side gets me x equals 1.75 plus or minus 1.44. Now it says to find the value of x. There are two possibilities here, the plus and the minus. So, if I use the plus, I've got 1.75 plus 1.44. That's going to give me 3.19. If I use the minus, that's 1.75 minus 1.44. That's giving me 0.31. So x is the time taken to do the first part of the walk. So she's walking 2 kilometers. Sorry, x is the speed for this walk. So she's doing 2 kilometers at x kilometers per hour. She's either walking at about 3 kilometers per hour or at 0.31 kilometers per hour. So if I had to guess which one was the most sensible answer, I would guess the 3.19 kilometers per hour. So that's what we'll go with.